Police! Open the door now. We got a call about domestic violence.
There's no one here besides me. I live alone. You must be at the wrong house.
You don't decide that. I need to see inside now.
Do you have a warrant? Unless you have it, I won't open the door.
Refusing to open the door will only make things worse for you.
The knock hit the door hard enough to rattle the frame. Not a polite tap, not a pause between strikes, just force, delivered without hesitation. Alicia Grant froze in the middle of her living room, one sock half on, her phone lying face down on the coffee table beside an open legal pad. The apartment had been quiet moments earlier, the kind of stillness that settles in on a slow afternoon when the city outside fades into background noise. Then the pounding came again, louder this time, followed immediately by a voice that carried authority without explanation. "Police, open the door now!" Alicia didn't move toward the door right away. Experience had taught her that urgency without clarity was often manufactured, not earned. Instead, she reached for her phone, turning it over and opening the Doorbell camera app with a motion so practiced it felt automatic. The live feed snapped on instantly, showing the narrow hallway outside her apartment, clean and empty except for one man, standing far too close to her door. He was white, mid-30s, uniform crisp, posture rigid. His face was tight with impatience, jaw clenched as if he'd already decided how this encounter would end. He didn't look concerned. He looked irritated. "Police," he repeated, closer now. "We got a call about domestic violence." The words landed with a dull weight, heavy enough to sound serious, but hollow the moment Alicia processed them. Domestic violence. In an apartment where she lived alone. No partner, no roommate, no guests. The silence behind her made the accusation feel almost surreal. "There's no one here besides me," she called through the door, keeping her voice even. "I live alone. You must be at the wrong house." There was no pause, no reconsideration, no follow-up question. The response came immediately, sharp and dismissive. "You don't decide that. I need to see inside now." That was the moment Alicia knew this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a test. Before we continue, if stories like this matter to you, take a second to support the channel. Hit like, leave a comment with where you're watching from, and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Subscribing is completely free, and it helps these stories reach more people. Alicia stepped closer to the door, stopping just short of touching it, her eyes never leaving the screen in her hand. The officer's face filled most of the frame now, close enough that she could see the faint redness around his eyes, the impatience in the way his shoulders rolled forward. He wasn't asking to check on her safety, he was demanding entry. "Do you have a warrant?" she asked calmly. "Unless you have one, I won't open the door." For the first time, there was a brief delay, not long enough to suggest he was considering his answer, just long enough to confirm there wasn't one. When he spoke again, his voice dropped slightly, the volume lower but the message more threatening. "Refusing to open the door will only make things worse for you." Alicia exhaled slowly, grounding herself. She had heard that sentence before, in body cam footage, in written reports, in court testimony, where officers explained later that they had been trying to gain compliance. She knew exactly how dangerous that phrasing could become once a door opened and control shifted. She didn't respond right away. Instead, she adjusted her phone, ensuring the camera angle remained clear, the timestamp visible, the audio unobstructed. Years of representing victims of police misconduct had trained her to think in layers. What was being said? What wasn't being said? What would matter later when the adrenaline wore off and the record remained? Outside, the officer shifted his weight, glancing briefly down the hallway, then back at her door. No backup arrived. No supervisor announced themselves. There was no urgency beyond the one he was trying to create. Alicia lived in that building for 4 years. It was quiet, predictable, filled with professionals who rarely crossed paths. There had never been a complaint about her unit. No calls, no warnings, nothing that would justify what was happening now. "I've told you everything you need to know," she said through the door. "I live alone. There is no domestic violence here." The officer scoffed softly, the sound carrying through the wood. "If you've got nothing to hide," he said, "this will be quick." That line almost made her laugh, but she held it back. Nothing to hide had never been the standard, and she knew better than to let sarcasm slip into the record. Instead, she remained silent, letting the weight of his words hang in the air where the camera could capture them untouched. Seconds stretched into minutes. On the screen, she watched his posture change, confidence giving way to irritation. irritation sliding toward uncertainty. He adjusted his radio, muttered something under his breath, then stepped back for the first time since arriving. The distance between him and the door grew, just enough to signal retreat without admitting it. Finally, he turned and walked away down the hallway, his boots echoing briefly before disappearing out of frame. The feed returned to stillness, the hallway empty once more, as if nothing had happened at all. But Alicia knew better. What the officer had just done, using a domestic violence claim to pressure entry without evidence, wasn't just inappropriate, it was actionable, and the doorbell camera had captured every second of it. She saved the video, she wrote down the time, and without knowing it yet, that officer had just taken the first step toward a lawsuit that would cost the city millions. The hallway stayed empty long after the officer disappeared, the doorbell camera continuing to record as if waiting for something else to happen. Alicia stood still for several seconds, listening for footsteps that didn't return, for radios that didn't crackle back to life. When nothing came, she locked the deadbolt again even though it had never been unlocked, then stepped back into her living room and sat down slowly, the adrenaline still buzzing beneath her skin. She replayed the video immediately, not because she needed to confirm what had happened, but because she needed to see it the way everyone else would eventually see it, without context, without emotion, just facts and tone and body language frozen in time. The officer's closeness to the door, his lack of questions, the way domestic violence was deployed like a key instead of a concern, the threat disguised as advice. It was all there, clean and undeniable. Alicia exported the clip, backed it up twice, and emailed a copy to herself with a subject line she'd used too many times before: preserve evidence. Then she opened a fresh document and began typing, not a narrative, not an argument, but a timeline, arrival time, statements made, requests, refused, departure time, the absence of exigent circumstances, the lack of backup, the failure to identify a victim. She kept it clinical, because clinical was harder to dismiss. Within an hour, she filed a formal complaint with the department's Internal Affairs Division. She attached the video, the transcript she'd already drafted, and a brief sworn statement that did nothing more than describe what had happened. No conclusions, no accusations, just facts. She didn't expect a response right away. Departments rarely moved quickly when the complaint was about one of their own, especially when no arrest had been made and no force had been used. On paper, this would be easy to minimize: a welfare check, a miscommunication, an officer was acting out of an abundance of caution. She had heard all of it before. 2 days later, the call came. The voice on the other end was polite, measured, and immediately careful, the kind of tone Alicia recognized as someone choosing words as they spoke them. The caller identified himself as a lieutenant from professional standards and thanked her for bringing the matter to their attention. He said they were looking into it. He asked if she would be willing to answer a few questions. Alicia agreed on speakerphone, recording the call. The questions came slowly. Where was she standing during the encounter? Had she felt threatened? Did the officer ever explicitly say he would force entry? Did she know why someone might have called in a domestic violence complaint? Each question felt less like fact-finding and more like an attempt to locate an explanation that didn't involve misconduct. She answered calmly, precisely, never speculating, never filling silence with unnecessary detail. When asked if she could think of anyone who might have been concerned about her safety, she said no. When asked if she'd ever had previous interactions with law enforcement at that address, she said no. When asked whether she believed the officer had acted with malicious intent, she declined to characterize intent at all. "I'm here to describe what happened," she said. "The video does that better than I can." The lieutenant thanked her again and ended the call. Weeks passed, nothing happened, no follow-up, no acknowledgement that the officer had been interviewed, no indication that the department saw anything wrong with what had occurred. Alicia wasn't surprised. Silence was a response of its own, and she understood what it meant. Left alone, this would be filed away, reduced to a note, and forgotten. So, she didn't leave it alone. Alicia filed a public records request. She asked for dispatch logs tied to her address on the date of the incident. She requested records of calls categorized as domestic violence within a 1-block radius during the same time window. She requested the officer's assignment that day, his precinct, his call history, and any supervisory approvals related to his presence at her building. The response took time, and when it came, it arrived incomplete. The dispatch logs showed no domestic violence call tied to her unit. None. There was a single vague entry marked welfare check, but it lacked a caller ID, lacked notes, lacked follow-up, and had been cleared almost immediately. The officer's assignment placed him outside her precinct. His supervisor had not been notified before or during the encounter. There was no documented victim, no corroboration, no urgency. The more Alicia read, the clearer the pattern became. This wasn't a one-off. She found 2 prior complaints in public records from women in neighboring districts, both describing late afternoon or weekend visits from officers citing vague safety concerns. Both complaints had been marked unsubstantiated. Neither included video, neither went anywhere. Alicia contacted one of the complainants through a mutual professional contact. The woman hesitated at first, then agreed. To speak, her story was uncomfortably familiar. An officer, a vague claim, pressure to open the door, a retreat when challenged, no consequences afterward. That was when Alicia made the decision to escalate beyond internal processes. She drafted a federal civil rights complaint, not just against the officer, but against the city itself, alleging a pattern of unconstitutional knock and demand practices, misuse of domestic violence classifications, and failure to supervise or discipline officers who use safety pretexts to pressure entry into private residences. The video from her doorbell camera became Exhibit A. Halfway through drafting, she paused. If you're still with this story, take a second right now. Hit like, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the outcome. Subscribing is free, and it helps stories like this stay visible. The city responded quickly once the lawsuit was filed. Emails came first, then calls. A representative from the city attorney's office requested a meeting. They emphasized their commitment to community trust, to accountability, to taking concerns seriously. They suggested mediation. They suggested narrowing the scope. They suggested that perhaps this could be resolved quietly. Alicia declined. Discovery moved forward. Internal emails surfaced showing confusion about how the incident had been logged. One supervisor questioned why a domestic violence label had been used without a victim. Another noted that the officer had a history of over-assertive contact. A third suggested retraining. None suggested discipline. The officer's deposition came next. Under oath, he struggled. He couldn't identify the caller. He couldn't explain why no backup was requested. He couldn't articulate what specific facts led him to believe a domestic violence incident was occurring. When shown the video, he claimed his words had been taken out of context, that he had felt something was off. Feelings, Alicia reminded him gently, were not probable cause. By the time the case reached the negotiation stage, the city's posture had changed entirely. What began as quiet dismissal turned into risk management. The video was too clean. The paper trail is too thin. The pattern is too obvious. They offered a settlement, Alicia countered. After months of back and forth, the city agreed to pay $2.4 million, implement revised training protocols, and issue a written acknowledgement that the officer's conduct violated departmental policy. The officer was reassigned and placed under review. The city insisted there was no admission of wrongdoing. The video told a different story. The settlement agreement was signed quietly, without cameras, without a press conference, without any visible acknowledgement from the department beyond carefully worded legal language that avoided responsibility while conceding enough to close the case. Alicia read every line twice before signing, not because she didn't trust her own work, but because she understood how much meaning could hide in phrasing designed to look harmless. $2.4 million. That number carried weight, even if the city tried to bury it. It wasn't just compensation for what had happened at her door. It was a valuation of risk, a calculation of how dangerous that footage was if allowed to breathe outside a courtroom. For a few weeks after the settlement, nothing changed on the surface. The officer remained employed. The department released a brief internal memo about updated procedures. No apology was issued, no admission was made. From the outside, it looked like another case resolved and forgotten. Then the footage leaked. Alicia never confirmed how it got out, and she didn't need to. Someone inside the system understood what it meant and decided it shouldn't stay hidden. The video appeared first on a local independent news site, embedded in an article that described it without editorial flourish, letting the images and audio speak for themselves. Within hours, it was shared again and again, stripped of context and reposted by people who recognized exactly what they were watching. A white officer, a closed door, a domestic violence claim with no victim, a calm black woman refusing to surrender her rights, a threat delivered softly enough to sound reasonable if you weren't listening carefully. The department responded the next morning. A spokesperson released a statement emphasizing the seriousness of domestic violence calls and reiterating that officers are required to ensure safety. The statement did not address why no backup was requested, why no victim was identified, or why the officer was outside his assigned precinct. It did not explain the lack of a dispatch record. It did not explain the settlement. Journalists did. Within days, reporters uncovered the public records Alicia had already reviewed. They confirmed that no domestic violence call had been logged for her address. They confirmed that the incident had been reclassified after the fact. They interviewed former officers who admitted, off the record, that domestic was sometimes used as a shortcut to gain compliance when other justifications didn't exist. The pressure mounted. City council members requested briefings. Advocacy groups demanded transparency. Community meetings filled with residents asking the same question over and over again. How often did this happen when no one was recording? The officer was placed on administrative leave 2 weeks later. Internal Affairs reopened its investigation, this time under scrutiny that made quiet dismissal impossible. Emails surfaced showing that supervisors had been aware of similar complaints in the past and had chosen retraining over discipline. Training logs showed the officer had completed multiple constitutional policing courses without incident. The disconnect was impossible to ignore. Alicia was asked to testify before a civilian oversight board. She didn't dramatize anything. She didn't raise her voice. She walked them through the video frame by frame, pausing at the moment the officer said refusing to open the door would make things worse. She explained how that phrase functioned in practice, how it blurred the line between advice and threat, how often it preceded illegal entry in the cases she litigated. When she finished, the room stayed quiet longer than usual. 3 months later, the officer resigned. The department framed it as a personal decision. The Oversight Board's report framed it differently. It cited misuse of authority, failure to follow protocol, and conduct inconsistent with departmental values. It recommended mandatory changes to how domestic violence calls were classified and audited, including automatic supervisory review when no victim was identified. The policy changes passed unanimously. Alicia returned to her work, representing clients whose names would never make headlines, whose encounters would never be recorded cleanly, whose cases would hinge on fragments and inconsistencies instead of high-definition footage. She installed additional cameras. She advised her clients to do the same. The doorbell camera still hangs outside her apartment. Every time she walks past it, she's reminded of how close that moment came to becoming something far worse. Not because of force, but because of how easily authority can be abused when it isn't challenged. Before you go, take a second. If this story made you think, hit like, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Subscribing is completely free, and it helps keep stories like this in front of the people who need to see them most. The city paid the money quietly. There was no press conference announcing it, no official apology delivered behind a podium, no acknowledgement framed as accountability. The payment moved through the system the same way all uncomfortable truths did, reduced to paperwork, coded into budgets, absorbed as a cost of doing business. To the city, the settlement was a financial problem that had been solved. To Alicia, it was proof that someone, somewhere, had finally understood how dangerous that knock at her door really was. $2.4 million changed hands without ceremony. What followed mattered more. Inside the police department, the incident refused to disappear the way similar complaints had in the past. The video made that impossible. It didn't rely on interpretation. It didn't require trust. It didn't soften the moment with hindsight. It showed exactly what happened in real time. The officer's body language, his proximity to the door, the casual way he invoked domestic violence without ever identifying a victim, without ever asking if anyone inside needed help. Supervisors were forced to watch it, more than once. At first, the reaction was defensive. Some argued the officer had been acting out of caution. Others insisted the footage didn't capture the full context. A few quietly questioned why the camera angle made the officer look so aggressive, as if the lens itself had an agenda. Those arguments collapsed quickly once the dispatch records were placed alongside the video. No call, no notes, no backup request, no exigent circumstances, just a door and a demand. Training officers began using the footage in closed sessions, not officially labeled as a failure, but discussed in the careful language departments preferred when admitting too much felt dangerous. Officers were reminded to slow down, to articulate reasons clearly, to request supervisors when using sensitive classifications, like domestic violence. The phrase knock and demand started appearing more frequently in internal memos, usually accompanied by warnings about civil liability. None of this was publicized, but it happened. The officer at the center of it all tried to keep his head down at first. He declined interviews, he avoided public comment. For a while, he continued reporting to work under modified duties, his presence tolerated but no longer trusted. Colleagues stopped joking around him. Supervisors watched him more closely. Every report he filed was scrutinized with an intensity he had never experienced before. He wasn't used to being watched. That pressure wore on him faster than discipline ever could. Within months, he submitted his resignation. The department accepted it without protest. No termination, no admission, just a quiet exit that allowed everyone to move on without further exposure. For Alicia, life didn't snap back into place the way outsiders might expect. Winning didn't bring relief so much as clarity. The case confirmed what she had known for years, but could rarely prove so cleanly, that abuse of authority didn't always come with raised voices or drawn weapons. Sometimes it came politely, sometimes it came wrapped in concern. Sometimes it came disguised as protection. She continued practicing law, taking on cases that reminded her why the work mattered. Clients came to her shaken, confused, certain that something felt wrong but unsure how to explain it. She listened. She asked questions. She looked for patterns. And more often than not, she saw the same tactics repeated with slight variations, especially against people who didn't know when or how to say no. The doorbell camera stayed mounted beside her door. She didn't think about it every day, but she noticed it in small moments, when packages were delivered, when neighbors passed by, when maintenance knocked unexpectedly. Each time, it reminded her that evidence didn't just protect the innocent, it preserved truth before power had time to rewrite it. Occasionally, she was asked whether she felt safer now. The question never had a simple answer. She felt more prepared, more alert, more aware of how quickly routine interactions could shift. She understood better than ever how much depended on documentation, on staying calm, on refusing to be rushed into compliance by someone who benefited from speed and confusion. The city implemented its policy changes and moved on. The department issued internal guidance and moved on. The officer left and moved on. Alicia didn't move on in the same way. She carried the lesson forward, not as fear, but as resolve. She advised her clients to install cameras if they could. She reminded them that politeness and firmness could coexist. She taught them that silence was sometimes more powerful than argument, especially when silence was recorded. Years from now, the footage might resurface again in a training module or a civil rights report, stripped of names and details, reduced to an example. That didn't matter. What mattered was that the moment existed, preserved exactly as it happened, immune to reinterpretation. Because power depends on forgetting, and cameras do not forget. Before you go, take a moment. If this story mattered to you, hit like, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Subscribing is completely free, and it helps ensure stories like this don't get buried. Sometimes accountability doesn't arrive with sirens or headlines. Sometimes it starts with a closed door, a steady voice, and a camera that keeps recording when someone else expects it to stop.